What would you do if your father left you a cracked photograph at his will reading, while your stepbrother walked out with a 200 million media empire? Most people would go home and cry. Irene Calloway, 36, a second-grade teacher from Akron, Ohio, picked up the photograph, and that single decision changed everything. The lobby of Hargrove, Stills and Monroe was the kind of place designed to make you feel small. Dark walnut paneling lined every wall, and the carpet was so thick it swallowed the sound of footsteps entirely. At 11 in the morning on a grey Tuesday in March, the building smelled like lemon polish and old money, and Irene felt completely, humiliatingly out of her depth. She had taken a personal day. She had ironed her one blazer, a charcoal grey Ann Taylor she'd bought on clearance 4 years ago, and she had driven 3 hours from Akron because the lawyer's office had sent a certified letter requesting her presence at the estate reading of Lawrence Aldridge Calloway, age 74, founder of Calloway Media Group, the 4th largest independent broadcasting network in the United States. Her father, the man who had attended exactly one of her parent-teacher conferences, who had missed her college graduation for a shareholder dinner, who had not spoken to her in 6 years. Irene sat in the lobby and waited, a paper cup of lukewarm coffee going cold in her hands. Through the glass partition, she could see the conference room. Her stepmother, Pamela, was already inside, seated at the center of a long cherrywood table. Pamela was 52, blonde, immaculate in a black Armani wrap dress that probably cost more than Irene made in a month. Beside Pamela sat her son from her first marriage, Owen Fitch, who had spent the last 8 years operating as Lawrence Calloway's de facto second-in-command despite sharing neither his blood nor his original surname. Owen had the easy, loose-shouldered posture of a man who already knew how this was going to go. Beside them sat Owen's wife, a publicist named Amber, who was already scrolling her phone with one hand and gesturing with the other, speaking in a low, animated voice about something that clearly had nothing to do with grief. Irene watched them through the glass and understood, in her bones, that she was not meant to be here. She had been invited as a formality. A signature on a document, a face in a chair so no one could later claim the process was improper. The lawyer, a compact, silver-haired man named Thaddeus Monroe, opened the door and gestured for her to come inside. As Irene entered the conference room, Pamela glanced up and then looked back down at her phone without a single word. Owen offered a thin smile, the kind men give when they want you to know they're tolerating you. Irene sat at the far end of the table. The reading took 45 minutes. By the end of it, Pamela held controlling interest in Calloway Media Group, a 61% stake, plus the Beacon Hill townhouse, the Nantucket property, a Monet and 2 Klimps that lived in a climate-controlled storage unit in Manhattan, and a diversified investment portfolio that Monroe read aloud in a flat voice for what felt like a very long time. Owen received the broadcast licensing rights to the Southeast regional stations, a $40 million cash trust, and the London apartment. Amber received a $2 million personal bequest described, with clinical precision, as in recognition of her contributions to the Calloway household. Then Monroe turned the last page. "To my daughter, Irene Elise Calloway," he read, his voice carefully neutral, "I leave the contents of my personal desk in the Beacon Hill study. One item has already been removed and placed in trust with this office for delivery at the time of reading. It is to be given directly to Irene and to no one else." Monroe reached under the table and produced a small, padded envelope. He slid it down the cherrywood surface. It stopped in front of Irene. The room was absolutely silent. Irene looked at the envelope. Her name was on the front in her father's handwriting. Small, precise, slightly tilted to the right, exactly the way she remembered it from birthday cards she had stopped receiving at age 12. Owen leaned back in his chair. "That's it?" he said, glancing at Monroe. "That concludes the reading," Monroe confirmed. Owen looked at Irene with something that almost reached pity but landed closer to amusement. "Well, Dad always did appreciate minimalism." Pamela set her phone on the table with a soft click. She studied Irene with the calm, unhurried gaze of someone who had already won and knew it. I hope it's something meaningful, she said, her voice honey-smooth. He always said you didn't care about material things. Teachers never do they? Such a noble profession, she smiled. I'm sure you'll find your way back to Akron just fine. Irene did not respond. She picked up the envelope. It was lighter than she expected, slightly stiff, the kind of padding used to protect something flat and fragile. She stood up, tucked it under her arm, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. She made it to the women's restroom at the end of the hall, before her knees stopped working properly. She sat on a bench beside the vanity and pressed her back against the cool tile and breathed, one careful breath at a time, until the white edges faded from her vision. She opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph. Old, slightly warped, a 4x6 print that had clearly been handled many times over many years. The image showed a cabin on the edge of a lake, pine trees behind it, a wooden dock extending over still water. It was dusk in the photograph. The light was that specific amber color that only exists for about 11 minutes before the sun drops below the tree line. Irene did not recognize the cabin. On the back of the photograph, in her father's handwriting, Irene, you were 6 years old when I took this. You fell asleep on the drive, and I carried you inside. You never knew we were there. I went back every year after your mother left. I never stopped going. Dad, below the handwriting, a single line that had been added more recently. The pen color slightly different, the pressure heavier. Ask Monroe to show you the deed. He knows which one. Irene sat in the restroom for a long time. She did not cry. She stared at the photograph of a cabin she had no memory of visiting, at a note from a man she had spent 6 years trying to stop being angry at, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not warmth, not forgiveness, not yet. Just a small, particular stillness. Like the moment after a door opens, she went back out to the hallway. Monroe was standing near the elevator, briefcase in hand, speaking quietly with his assistant. When he saw Irene, he said something to the assistant, and the assistant walked away. Monroe looked at Irene for a moment, not with the careful blankness he'd worn during the reading, but with something that looked faintly like relief. You read the back, he said. He said to ask you about a deed. Monroe checked the hallway in both directions. Then he said quietly, Not here. There's a coffee shop 2 blocks north on Tremont. Can you be there in 15 minutes? Irene looked at him. Mr. Monroe, what is going on? Your father asked me to explain it in person, away from this building. He paused. He was very specific about the location. The coffee shop was small and warm, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and hand-chalked menus. Monroe arrived 2 minutes after Irene. He ordered nothing, sat across from her, and set his briefcase on the table. I've been your father's attorney for 26 years, he said. I drafted his first media licensing contract. I was there when he built Calloway Media from 2 local AM stations and a handshake deal. I watched what happened to your family after your mother left, and I watched what Pamela did, very carefully, very systematically over the last 11 years. Irene wrapped both hands around her coffee. What did Pamela do? Monroe was quiet for a moment. Owen Fitch has been the operational head of Calloway Media for 8 years. What the board does not know, what the SEC does not yet know, is that Owen has been routing licensing revenue through a subsidiary called Bridgeton Media Solutions. Bridgeton is wholly owned by Pamela. Over 8 years, we believe approximately $34 million in network revenue has been quietly redirected. Irene stared at him. That's embezzlement. That's a federal crime, yes. Monroe reached into his briefcase and produced a manila folder. Your father suspected it for 3 years. By the time he had confirmation, he was already managing a diagnosis. Stage 3 cardiac sarcoidosis. He was told 18 months ago that he had perhaps 12 to 18 months. He used that time to do 2 things. The first was to restructure his public estate in a way that left Pamela and Owen holding controlling interest in a company that was, by design, far less valuable than it appeared. Irene frowned. What does that mean? It means that Calloway Media Group's flagship broadcast licenses, the ones that actually generate revenue, were quietly transferred, over the past 14 months, to a separate holding company your father created, a private LLC called Aldridge Signal Partners. The licenses Pamela received today grant controlling interest in the parent corporation, but the parent corporation no longer owns the assets that generate income. She inherited a name and a logo and a significant amount of operating debt. Irene felt the coffee shop go slightly surreal around her. And the second thing he did, Monroe reached into the folder and slid a single document across the table. It was a deed. Property in Linden County, New Hampshire, recorded under Aldridge Signal Partners. The transfer date was 11 months ago. The cabin in the photograph, Monroe said, and the 340 acres surrounding it, and the broadcast licensing portfolio now held inside a trust registered at that address. He paused. The total value of the assets held by Aldridge Signal Partners is currently estimated at $310 million. Irene put down her coffee. You are the sole beneficiary, Monroe said, and as of this morning, you are the sole owner and registered controller of Aldridge Signal Partners, LLC. The sound of the coffee shop, chairs scraping, an espresso machine running, two people laughing near the window, came back to Irene all at once, like the volume being turned up on a television she hadn't realized was muted. He left me a photograph of a cabin, she said, mostly to herself. He left you the cabin, Monroe said, and everything in it. They drove north for 4 hours. Monroe insisted on driving. He said Lawrence had been very specific that the first visit should happen in daylight, with someone who knew the roads. They took Route 93 out of Boston, then a series of increasingly narrow state highways, and then a gravel road that wound through birch trees so densely planted it felt like passing through a tunnel. Irene held the photograph in her lap for most of the drive. She thought about being 6 years old. She had no memory of this place. Monroe had explained that Lawrence brought her in the off-season, in the deep quiet of late autumn when no one was around, and she had indeed fallen asleep in the car. Her mother had not been there. It was just the two of them, and she had slept through the whole thing. She thought about what it meant. A man who could not figure out how to be a present father, who found it easier to run a company than have a conversation, who had still quietly, in the way small gestures sometimes carry more weight than grand ones, kept a photograph of his sleeping daughter on his desk for 30 years. She didn't know what to do with that. She set it alongside everything else she didn't know what to do with, and looked out the window at the trees. The gravel road ended at a gate, not imposing, just a simple wooden post gate strung with a single chain and a padlock. Monroe reached into his briefcase and produced a key on a plain ring. He handed it to Irene. She got out of the car, unlocked the gate, and swung it open. The drive beyond the gate curved for another quarter-mile through pines before it opened onto the lake. And Irene stopped walking. The cabin in the photograph was real. She was looking at it. The same roof line, the same wooden dock, the same angle of the tree line. But the photograph had been taken 30 years ago, and the cabin was not a cabin. It was a compound. The main structure was a low, sprawling New England timber frame, 4,000 square feet at minimum, every window facing the water. A screened porch ran the full length of the lakeside. To the left, partially obscured by a stand of birches, was a smaller guest structure. To the right, a boathouse with the doors open, a flat-bottom aluminum boat rocking gently inside. The dock extended out into a lake, so still it held the reflection of the sky like a mirror. And in the center of the main cabin's front door, no keypad, no code, a lock that matched the key already in Irene's hand. She crossed the gravel, walked up 3 wooden steps, and turned the key. The door swung open onto a great room with 14-foot ceilings, a fieldstone fireplace the height of a man, and walls lined floor-to-ceiling with books. The furniture was worn in the way that expensive things get worn with actual use. There was a wool blanket folded the arm of a leather sofa that Irene recognized. It had been in her parents' house when she was a child. The red and gray one her mother used to complain about because it shed on everything. Lawrence had taken the blanket. On the oak desk in the corner, beside a lamp and a leather-bound journal, was a small digital recorder. A yellow adhesive note on top of it read, in Lawrence's handwriting, "Press play. Do this alone." Irene looked at Monroe. He nodded once and walked back toward the porch. She sat down at the desk, picked up the recorder, and pressed play. Her father's voice came out of the speaker, raspy at the edges, the way it had sounded the last time she'd heard it on the phone 6 years ago, but steady. "Irene, if you're listening to this, Monroe did his job, and you did yours. You took the photograph. I wasn't sure you would. I thought you might leave it on the table." A pause, and then something that sounded almost like a quiet laugh. "Your mother would have taken it. You're more like her than you know, and I mean that is the most straightforward compliment I've ever given anyone." Irene pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. "I owe you a conversation I kept finding reasons not to have. I'm going to try to have it now, because this is apparently the only format where I couldn't reschedule it." Another pause. "When your mother left, I told myself the best thing I could do was focus on the work, on building something. I told myself you'd understand when you were older. I told myself a lot of things that were true in some small degree, and completely wrong in all the ways that mattered. Pamela told me, 6 months after we married, that you had called her and been unkind. I believed her. I should have called you and asked, but I believed her because it was easier than admitting I had already failed you badly enough that you had a reason to be angry. That was the last conversation we had about you for 4 years, and by the time I understood what Pamela actually was, the distance had become so ordinary that I didn't know how to cross it." Irene was crying now. She hadn't decided to. It was just happening. "I kept this place because this is where I came when I needed to remember that I had been someone's father before I was anything else. There's a photograph in the frame on the desk. Not the one Monroe gave you. A different one. Look at it when you're ready." Irene looked up. A small wooden frame sat on the corner of the desk that she hadn't noticed. She reached for it. It was her, at 6 years old, asleep on a plaid car seat, one arm thrown over her face. In the background, barely visible through the windshield, was the front of this cabin. He had carried her inside. He had come back every year. He had kept a photograph of a sleeping 6-year-old on a desk in a cabin in the woods for 30 years. The company, Irene, the real company, the licenses, the thing that took 30 years to build. "It's yours. You'll have Monroe, and you'll have a financial team I've already assembled and briefed. You don't have to know anything about broadcasting. The people I hired do, but you own it. You decide what it becomes. What Pamela and Owen think they inherited will begin to collapse within 60 days. I made sure of that. I'm sorry that it happened this way, that I had to spend my last year building a trap instead of calling my daughter. If I could trade the trap for a phone call, I would. I know that's worth very little to you right now, and you're right to think so." A long pause, the kind that, on a phone call, you'd rush to fill. "I'm proud of you, Irene. I'm proud that you became someone who didn't need me. I'm proud that you put 32 children in a classroom every September and teach them that the world makes sense. I know you did that entirely without my help." His voice caught slightly. "I am so sorry for everything I didn't do. I love you. I have always loved you. I just never learned how to say it while I was standing in the same room as you." The recorder clicked off. Outside, a pair of Canada geese landed on the lake with a long, sliding rush of water. Irene could hear them through the window. She sat at her father's desk with the photograph of her 6-year-old self in her hands and let herself be completely, thoroughly undone. It took as long as it took. Nobody was waiting. 63 days later, the offices of Calloway Media Group filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The announcement sent a tremor through the regional broadcasting industry and produced a staggering amount of urgent phone calls to Pamela's attorney, none of which generated useful answers. The flagship broadcast licenses that the legal team had assumed were the core asset of the company were simply not there. They had been transferred, legally, properly, with full documentation filed 14 months prior. The company Pamela controlled was, as Lawrence had constructed it to be, an empty frame. The SEC investigation into Bridgeton Media Solutions was announced the following week. Owen's name appeared in the 3rd paragraph of the press release. Pamela's appeared in the 5th. Irene was at school when her phone lit up with the news. She was in the middle of explaining long division to a table of 8-year-olds and did not check her phone until after dismissal. When she finally read the alerts in the parking lot, sitting in her car with the heat running, she experienced a feeling she did not immediately have a name for. It wasn't triumph. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a thing being finished. Not cleanly, not happily, but accurately. The ending that the story had been building toward arriving on schedule. She called Monroe. "The SEC filing is moving faster than we expected," he said. "Owen's attorneys have already been in contact about a potential cooperation agreement, and the board of Aldridge Signal Partners is requesting your attendance at a preliminary strategy session in 2 weeks. There's a media consultant I'd like you to meet." Irene watched a minivan pull out of the school parking lot with a Stick Vigor family decal on the rear window. "Okay," she said. "You understand what this means for your position going forward. As primary rights holder to the broadcast licenses, you are now—" "I know what I am, Thaddeus. First names had happened somewhere around day 30. Give me 2 weeks with my class, then I'll come." Monroe paused. "Your father said you'd say something like that." Irene laughed, a real one, short and surprised. "What did he say exactly?" He said, "She'll ask for 2 weeks, give her the 2 weeks. She'll be sharper for it." Irene sat with that for a moment. He knew me pretty well for someone who wasn't around. He paid very close attention from a very unfortunate distance, Monroe said. I think that was his version of penance. She ended the call and sat in the parking lot a little longer. The afternoon light was doing that thing it does in March in Ohio. Thin and watery, falling at a low angle that makes everything look slightly more significant than it probably is. She pulled the old photograph from her bag. She'd been carrying it every day since Boston. The cabin at dusk, the lake, the amber light. She thought about a man who had carried his sleeping daughter inside without waking her, who had come back every year to a place that belonged to him and no one else, who had kept a cracked photograph on a desk in the woods because it was the only record he had of being a decent father, even briefly. She thought about how grief and anger and love can all live in the same drawer for 30 years, without resolving into anything simple. She didn't forgive him completely, not yet. She wasn't sure she would or needed to, but she tucked the photograph back into her bag, started the car, and drove home. 3 months after that, Irene Calloway walked into the executive floor of the newly renamed Aldridge Broadcasting Group in Boston, wearing a blazer that was not from a clearance rack. Monroe was already inside the glass-walled conference room, along with the 4-person board she had approved and the media consultant, a woman named Bridget Sawyer, who had restructured 2 regional networks and had the particular focused energy of someone who found these situations genuinely interesting. Bridget had already reorganized the licensing portfolio and identified $8 million in annual efficiencies that had been obscured under Owen's management. She had also, without being asked, compiled a full operational audit of every station in the network, a document that ran to 140 pages, and which Irene had read cover to cover on the train from Akron. Through the glass wall, Irene could see the network's morning programming playing on a monitor in the hallway, local news, weather, a segment about a school's supply drive, the kind of content that Lawrence had built his first station on 30 years ago, before it got complicated. She pushed open the conference room door. The board stood up. Irene set her bag on the table, pulled out her copy of Bridget's audit, annotated in red pen, flagged in 4 places, and sat down at the head of the table. "Page 17, she said. The Springfield affiliate. Walk me through why the morning block is underperforming." The 2nd grade teacher from Akron did not become a different person. She stayed in her classroom for the rest of the school year, drove up to Boston twice a month, asked questions that made the board shift in their chairs, and made 4 decisions in the first quarter that Bridget later described, in an interview with Broadcasting and Cable, as the kind of instincts that people with MBAs spend 20 years trying to develop. By October, Aldridge Broadcasting had settled into a new operational structure, expanded to 2 additional regional markets, and launched a community journalism initiative at 6 stations that won a regional Edward R. Murrow Award the following spring. Pamela pleaded guilty to 2 counts of federal wire fraud. Owen, who had cooperated with the SEC, received a suspended sentence, a substantial fine, and a 5-year bar from any role in media management. He moved back to Connecticut and, according to one mutual acquaintance, was managing a small property investment firm. And every August, Irene drove up to the cabin in New Hampshire alone. She would unlock the gate with the key on the plain ring, drive the 1/4 mile through the pines and sit on the dock until the light turned amber. She brought papers to read, or student work to mark, or sometimes nothing at all. She would watch the geese come in off the lake and think about the things a person can't undo and the things they can, and about how love, when it fails to be present, sometimes leaves its outline in the objects it holds onto. She kept the old photograph on the desk. The one of the cabin from 30 years ago. She didn't frame it. She leaned it against the lamp, the way her father had, and left it there. If Irene's story, from a cracked photograph to a $310 million broadcasting empire, left you thinking about the things we inherit that we never expected to receive, hit that like button and share this with someone who loves a story where the quiet person at the end of the table turns out to hold all the cards. Subscribe to Own the Drama for more stories where what looks like nothing turns out to be everything. And before you go, tell us in the comments, if someone handed you a photograph at the worst moment of your life, would you have stayed to ask what it meant?